brief us more on the key highlights of the economic survey, we have with us Chief Economic Advisor, Shri V. Anant Nageshwaranji. My warm welcome to you, sir. I also welcome Senior Economic Advisor, Ms. Chandni Raina, Economic Advisor, Shri Anthony Syriac, Economic Advisor, Dr. Anuradha Guru. Today's press conference will go as follows. First, the Chief Economic Advisor will give a presentation on the key narratives from the Economic Survey 24-25, followed by question and answer session. Over to Chief Economic Advisor, Shri V. Anant Nageshwaranji.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Although we are almost at the end of the first month of the current calendar year, still 11 more months to go. I wish you all a very happy and healthy 2025, and I hope you had a good first month already. So we will go into the presentation on what the Economic Survey 24-25 is about. This is a presentation on the Economic Survey contents rather than on the state of the economy per se, although which will be there towards the end of the presentation as well. The structure of today's presentation, we will cover the following issues: the changing global landscape and how India can rise the game for the new playing field. And in that segment, we will cover 4 areas, as you can see here: reform through deregulation, augmenting internal capacities for growth, the private sector's role in nation building, the energy transition the Indian way, state of the economy regaining momentum, and the growth outlook for FY26. The changing global landscape, we did cover that in the last survey as well. 2024 was the year of elections across the world. And most of us know that both qualitatively and in terms of quantitative dimensions, the world that existed between 1980, and you can choose the end point, some people would say 2008 or 2012, 16, etc. Roughly about 3 decades was the peak of globalization, hyper-globalization. As you can see in the statistics here, global exports went from 15% plus to 25%. Global FDI flows went from 0.5% of GDP to 3.75% of GDP. Global GDP itself rose 6 times in current prices. Extreme poverty came down because of faster growth in China and India. Internet penetration went from almost nothing to 23% as a share of world population. During this period, applied tariff rates across the world came down and the trade to GDP share went up. But clearly, you all know very well more than we do that this period has kind of ended. Even if we are not reversing very actively, we no longer are advancing along these dimensions. New import restrictions in every year were of the order of about 3,000 restrictions imposed by countries across the world. They have jumped to about 5,000 restrictions in the last 4 years. And the key reason that is cited by countries in imposing restrictions is strategic competitiveness. I think that is the important theme that we have to internalize as a country, both in the policy space and in the private sector space. There is strategic competitiveness. So therefore, efficiency considerations have given way to resilience and supply side security considerations. The value of trade covered under the new import restrictions was as low as $170 billion in 2014-15. Now it's more than $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion. So effectively, I think both import-export and investment flows are being looked at through the prism of strategic competition. And that is a new world which may be with us for quite some time to come, and therefore we need to get used to operating in this space. As a result, world FDI net inflows as a percentage of GDP has come down from around 5% in the first decade to around 1% of GDP. And world exports as a share of world GDP peaked, even though it may not have come down as much as investment flows have come down. Clearly, it is on a declining trend compared to the ascending trend we saw towards the end of the last millennium and in the first decade. One of the outcomes of the globalization era was also the rise of China as a manufacturing power. India also rose as a power in global services. So what has happened in the last 25, 30 years, and it is continuing even now, is in several high-tech, medium-tech areas, the presence of China is pervasive and dominant. And the manufacturing as a share of world gross output, China's share will probably be higher than the combined share of the next 10 countries. It gives them a lot of strategic levers and advantage in several areas, as we will see later in some other dimensions as well. This is an important development along with globalization in the last 40 years. Now, along with the dominance in manufacturing, in terms of the materials and minerals required for global energy transition, let's first take a look at the solar energy. Global demand in 2010 was, China's share of the global demand was very small. And therefore, China's production capacity in those areas was also quite small comparatively. But fast forward 11 years later, while demand has grown even within China, but the production capacity in that country has grown even more than demand, basically giving them an important lever in terms of the source of supply for all ingredients and components related to energy transition. And if you happen to see the September 2024 report of Mr. Mario Draghi on the European competitiveness, the entire 75-page report is full of European concerns about the concentration risk that is there with respect to one country as a source of supply for all critical components and technologies with respect to energy transition and manufacturing, etc. Moving on from solar energy to electric mobility, if you look at the key materials that go into it, copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and the rare earth materials, the dominance, and this is a slide which we have shown you back in July 2024 as well, the dominance of one country is quite clear. And in different stages of production, even if those materials are not mined in one country, the processing happens in a single country, and therefore whether it is the cell components or battery cells. In fact, the truth is every single panel, solar panel we install, every single electric vehicle that we produce in this country, naturally the dependence on a single source for supply keeps increasing. So that dependence has to be kept in mind in the pace of transition towards renewable energies and also with respect to electric mobility. So this is the global context, that the era of globalization, faster and larger movement of trade and goods and services and investments is behind us. And there is a huge presence of a single country, a phenomena that we have not seen in a very long time, at least since World War II. So given this, naturally, we have to raise the game for a new playing field. The playing field has changed, and the game has to be rely on domestic drivers of growth. So what are those domestic drivers of growth? That is what is part 2 about. Just to recap, we do have a goal a legitimate economic and social aspiration to become a developed country by 2047. The last economic survey broke it down into multiple components, generating about 8 million, 80 lakh jobs per year, increasing our share of manufacturing in GDP, plugging Indian businesses into global value chains, and creating a viable small, medium enterprise sector, which in the German language is called the Mittelstand. Because countries that basically became powerhouses in manufacturing had succeeded in creating a viable small medium enterprise sector. Therefore, our goal with respect to manufacturing is inextricably tied to the success of being able to raise the share of SME enterprises as well. Therefore, what is the action? The action is we have to raise our game on domestic growth. And how do we do that? There are 4 dimensions to it. One is deregulation for growth, augmenting internal capacities for growth, the role of the private sector in nation building, and doing energy transition the Indian way. First, we start with the deregulation for growth. Now, when we talk of deregulation, it is not even big ticket deregulation or dismantling of the licensing era, which happened in 1991 and pursued by governments over the last 30 plus years. We are talking about the nuts and bolts or the plumbing of deregulation, which particularly affect enterprises, be they in services or be they in manufacturing, which affect them in terms of the time and the resource bandwidth that they have. And these are related to local level rules, laws, and regulations. So this is the deregulation exercise, which will probably not be a news story in the front pages, but that kind of deregulation at the local and the state government level have to happen pervasively for us not only to boost MSMEs, to boost manufacturing, but also to lift the potential GDP growth in the country. And this applies in the areas of labor and even in the education sector as well. We'll share with you a few examples. These are the areas where I think the regulations that are there today affect the day-to-day activities of businesses that don't have the kind of bandwidth which large enterprises have. Whether it is in land, building and construction, utilities, logistics, and there are sector-specific deregulation areas, and you can see more of them in chapter 5 and also across other chapters in the economic survey. In general, we are obviously in the presentation, I can't go into all the issues which are there in the chapter. Just to illustrate, compliance costs make it cheaper to run a 150 worker factory than one 300 worker factory, whereas it should be the other way around. Regulations also disproportionately affect small businesses. If you look at the building restrictions, the setbacks to be allowed on all the 4 sides of a building, the floor area ratio restrictions, parking regulations, etc., take away much of the land available at the ground floor level for businesses. So actually manufacturing can start only from the first floor onwards in many small enterprises, both in urban and rural India, if they fully comply with the letter and spirit of these regulations. Naturally, that raises the fixed cost of doing business, and naturally, it also disincentivizes more hiring. So deregulation is not just about ease of doing business, it is a pathway to employment generation. And naturally, we also know that many states impose a high markup on electricity costs supplied to businesses compared to other non-businesses. And whereas in countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, particularly in Vietnam, which we look up to, it is the other way around in terms of being our next important competitive country. They have the opposite problem, which is that the cost of electricity supplied to industries is on the lowest side there compared to what we have in India. And by the way, this is not just a theoretical exercise. We have done, and you will see more of it in chapter 7, we looked at those states which have progressed a lot on business reform action plan, and lo and behold, those states have a much higher level of industrial activity. So there is a positive correlation between BRAP and the level of industrial activity that is there in these states. Moving on from industry to employment-related areas where deregulation can be pursued, in general, we do specify the number of hours workers can work daily and weekly. Every country has it. But the problem is we have restriction that this shall be adhered to week after week after week, whereas other countries give flexibility to the enterprises to be able to achieve this over a longer period, 3 months or 6 months. Your overall working hours cannot exceed this. But in a given week, there could be more or less work depending on demand surges. So that flexibility is missing. The same thing with respect to Factories Act on overtime working hours as well. The stipulated overtime hours are lower than competing nations, even though the overtime wages are higher in India on paper. The hours that people can be asked to work overtime is limited. And this is something that the workers and the management can negotiate between themselves, depending on order flows and so on and so forth. Moving on to higher education in particular, where I think market forces can play a much better role in ensuring quality outcomes. The University Grants Commission specifies minimum credits for various course categories and in what sequence as well. These aspects could be entrusted to the institutions themselves, and the institutions must remain free to remain must be free to remain flexible with their coursework. This will allow them to adapt to changing market demands, and we should basically trust the faculty and students to find solutions to these problems. These are all areas where we don't have to micromanage, and that is something this is just examples of deregulation we can undertake in industry, employment, and education. Moving on to part B of domestic drivers of growth, this is to continue to do the work we have been doing in the last 10 years on augmenting internal capacities for growth. And in July 2024, in agriculture, we devoted a lot of time in both chapter 5 on the medium-term outlook on how agriculture can be freed in terms of empowering farmers to be able to produce the maximum value and raise productivity. And we deliberately call it the sector of the future because there is enough scope to raise the contribution of agriculture by 0.75% to 1% in terms of GDP growth by empowering farmers, as we wrote in the last July survey. And there are examples which we have cited in this survey as well from different states, and also both in terms of land pooling and also in terms of irrigation potential, which we have done quite well in the last 8 years. The area under micro irrigation has gone up by 3 times, and that can actually be an important factor. So bringing more area under irrigation, land pooling, and giving farmers the freedom to sell wherever, whenever, to whomsoever, at whatever prices, while undertaking different intervention mechanisms to take care of the demand side. That is the right combination that can unlock up to 1% of incremental growth from the agriculture sector. And given our size and given the impact climate change will have on some other nations in Africa and Asia, this will also give India a huge diplomatic and strategic leverage if we are able to become the breadbasket for many countries around the world. So this sector is not something that countries do well in their early stage of development, but given the change in globalization and given climate change, this sector can be a sector for the future as well. And as you see here on the left side, allied sectors in agriculture have been able to grow at much faster rate than the mainstream crops and food grains. So therein lies the clue as to what are all the elements from those areas which can be applied to traditional crop areas that will lift the overall growth rate of the agriculture sector. In terms of infrastructure development, we have done quite well in the last 10 years in particular, whether in terms of introducing new trains, new airports. We're contributing to reduced turnaround time in ports, coming down from 48 hours to 30 hours in the last couple of years, and capacity additions in the power sector, falling data cost, and expansion in telecom infrastructure. These are some of the illustrations we have picked up for highlighting here, but there are more details in chapter 6. We also, last time itself, we wrote about the turnaround logistics costs also have come down in the country, and turnaround time in toll booths, etc., and road transport are all contributing to higher production and distribution efficiency in the country. Particularly with respect to the urban India, cities declared open defecation free have gone from 15% to saturation coverage, and household latrines constructed, public toilets constructed, and waste processed as a percentage of waste generated. There is tangible and substantial progress in many of these dimensions. On the right side, what you see is that PM Awas Yojana urban and also Amrut in terms of water coverage, 70% tap water and 62% sewage coverage, and also the expansion of metro rail system. The reason we put it up here is that public transportation has to play a much bigger role in our energy transition and energy demand going forward, much more than in fact private mobility solutions, including e-mobility. Public transportation holds the key, and that is why not only we have 1,000 kilometers operational, we have equally another 1,000 kilometers that are underway. So this will, if we can integrate the public transportation network, our carbon emissions and also cleaner air and road congestion, all these dimensions will be addressed by utilizing public transportation infrastructure more efficiently. In terms of rural economy, the Swachh Bharat mission, 11.8 crore toilets in villages. Mission Amrit Sarovar, again, if you look at the chapter on in agriculture and in industry, we talk about the importance of rejuvenating water bodies in contributing to the entire community development rather than purely providing water sufficiency. The National Health Mission, Sansad Adarsh Gram Yojana, empowering members of parliament to adopt villages and contributing to village development. Jal Jeevan Mission, 12.2 crore households provided, and Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Grameen, 2.7 crore houses completed. Now, in terms of infrastructure, it is not enough to talk only about the physical infrastructure. We have done quite well with respect to at the general government level, not just the union government. The overall expenditure has gone up from 10.4 lakh crores across the country between center and states to 25.7 lakh crores on social services, primarily health, education, etc. And this is a growth rate of more than this is the multiple of about 2.5 times in the last 7 years. And in terms of the building blocks for better education, the foundational literacy and numeracy, central and state government initiatives are covered. One is the Nipun Bharat initiative, the mission to ensure that every child attains foundational literacy and numeracy by the end of grade 3 by 2026. Some of the specific examples are also covered in the economic survey. Initiatives and interventions in states like Bihar and Gujarat are also given adequate coverage in chapter 11 of the economic survey. Apart from that, we also highlighted several private sector not-for-profit initiatives in these dimensions, whether with respect to learning or social and emotional learning, which are not typically covered in classroom textbook learning. All the private sector initiatives or not-for-profit initiatives that can be replicated and scaled up, and specific state level initiatives that are working well, which can also be considered as possible models to be adopted elsewhere. We have covered them in great detail in chapter 11. The good news is that the proof of the pudding is there in the data. The latest annual State of Education report for 2024, which Pratham brought out a couple of days ago, the proportion of standard 3 children in government schools who can read up to standard 2 has gone up from 16.3% to 23.4%. And in middle school, major improvements in basic reading and arithmetic seen in all grades, and the progress at the high school level, more than 75% can do basic digital tasks. And the same report also covers the availability of infrastructure that facilitates learning in the classroom in terms of midday meal being served, drinking water availability, usable toilets, and usable toilets for girls in particular as well. In all these areas, in the last 6 years, there has been noticeable improvement as well. Skilling initiatives found a prominent place in the last budget presented in July. And many of these initiatives, in fact, it looks as if I have